This is a Rogue Media Network podcast.
Home Abstract and Title Company was founded in 1867 and is the oldest company still operating in McLennan County. Home Abstract is comprised of a team of honest, friendly, hardworking professionals dedicated to providing both commercial and residential real estate clients with the highest level of communication and service. Their team is committed to working hard and building and maintaining strong relationships because transactions are so much more than just deals. They are clients, deserving of the courtesy, care, and respect that Home Abstract and Title Company is known for. Visit Home Abstract and Title Company at homeabstract.com.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn. Cross the Brazos and Waco, I'm safe when I reach San Antonio. He glanced back over his shoulder, the posse was nowhere in sight.
Okay, welcome back to the Waco History Podcast. We are continuing our Crossroads series, and there's only one guest that we could bring in for this particular Crossroads that we're going to talk about, Rick. And
what are we talking about today?
Well, I'm going to let you introduce the topic and our guest.
Yeah, well, I'll do that. So we're going to talk about the criminal crossroads of Texas. You know, any great crossroads town is going to have a lot of great criminal history, and unfortunately,
great and exclamation.
We have our share of that.
Yeah.
And in order to talk about this subject in depth, we've invited Sheriff Parnell McNamara to join us. He's been the McLennan County Sheriff. Was elected in 2012, started in January 2013. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Good to be here. Thank you, guys.
It's great having you here. We'd love to start out, Sheriff, with just your family has a long Waco history, a long Texas history. We'd love to hear just a little bit about your family background here in Waco.
Sure. Family came over from Ireland in the 1870s and settled in the Bosqueville area. My great-grandparents had 6 sons and a daughter. My grandfather was Emmett Parnell, and he was a deputy sheriff here in 1905 and then went with U.S. Marshals. His brother, Guy McNamara, was the one that actually started our family in law enforcement in 1902. He was elected constable here and then was appointed chief of police in 1915. And then in the early 30s, President Roosevelt appointed him the head United States Marshal for the Western District of Texas, which went from Centerville to El Paso. And then my father, T.P. McNamara, was the chief deputy sheriff here in the early 30s. I think he was hired on when he was 21 years old. And then he served in that capacity for a number of years. And then in 1942, he was hired on as a deputy United States Marshal. And he served in that capacity for right at 37 years. So anyway, my brother and I, Mike, my brother, we were hired as part-time guards for the U.S. Marshals in January of 1963. I was 16, my brother was 15, and couldn't do that today. But
we call those internships now. Wow.
Yeah, well, it was pretty good on-the-job training, but we were guards for my father. And I was a senior at Richfield High, and Mike was a junior. So we would help my dad transport prisoners to El Reno, Leavenworth, Kansas. We'd make arrests with him. We didn't have a badge or an ID, but we had guns. And he had us on the firing range all the time. So he was the only deputy U.S. Marshal in the 13-county area that Waco took care of. So he needed guards, and he got permission from the U.S. Department of Justice to use us as guards. And so they said, well, TP, your boys are awfully young. And he said, I know that, but I never have to worry about where they're going to be. They're going to be right there with me. So they agreed to let us on. So
wow.
For about 8 years, Mike and I worked as...
Did they count that time towards your retirement time?
Absolutely not. So anyway, I wish they had. But then when Mike and I graduated from Baylor, I actually graduated in 69, took an extra year pre-law and real estate, and then Mike graduated in 70. So right out of Baylor, both of us hired on with U.S. Marshals as deputies in October of 1970. And so this October will be 53 years I've been in law enforcement. And if you count my guard time, you can maybe 58, but 50.
We'll count it here. We'll
I
apply it to
I
your
appreciate
record.
that. But anyway, we were off and running, and the first 7 years of our career was just absolutely incredible because we were assigned to the Waco office. So it was my dad and my brother and me in the Waco U.S. Marshal's office. And then that new law where at the time, if you had 20 years of service and you were 55 years old, you had to retire. So he was 67. It got hundreds and hundreds of good U.S. Marshals. And a few years later, they bumped it up to 57. So age 57 got me in 2003 and got my brother in 04. So you have to retire the last day of the month you turn 57. So I turned 57 April 29th. So I got one more day. It was bad. It was sad. You know, 57, I was not ready to retire. I was mad about it. You get hurt. A lot of people want to leave, but Mike and I did not. We loved our job, and there's still a standing joke that there's claw marks on the carpet of the U.S. Marshal's office where they had to drag me out. And I had 14 boxes of memorabilia that had been built up from the days when my dad was in the office. We had a lot of his things, and so I had a pickup truck full and had to leave my credentials and my badge on the desk. And that was a bad feeling, leaving a building where I had worked for almost 33 years. And the only identification I had was my driver's license and my Sam's card when I walked across the street.
Where are the offices, U.S. Marshal offices in Waco?
They were on the third floor of the U.S. Post Office, corner of 8th and Franklin.
Okay.
That's where they all were. So, and that's where they still are. So anyway, I was retired and then ran for sheriff and got it. And so here I am. I'm still in the fight. I'm too young to retire. So.
That's great. Now,
anyway.
Now I've always said the McNamaras are thick in Bosqueville. I mean, there's a lot of them, and there's been other McNamaras in the history of Waco that have been engaged in law enforcement or in the justice system, besides the ones you mentioned.
Right. John McNamara, John B. McNamara, who was the son of the original John that was the county attorney here. He went with the FBI in 1942, was transferred immediately to New York, assigned to Harlem, and he stayed a few years with the FBI. And he went, I believe he hired on the same year, the same month that my dad hired on with U.S. Marshals, and they were first cousins.
Gotcha.
So there's been, been some other McNamaras in law enforcement.
Yeah.
Great. Well, tell us a little bit about the sheriff's department. I think most people recognize that you got police departments, you got sheriff's departments, you got constables, you got U.S. Marshals, and so Texas Rangers. Where does in law enforcement, where does the sheriff's department fit in?
The sheriff's department is the premier law enforcement agency in the county, and we have broad jurisdiction. We have jurisdiction out in the county and also inside the cities that are in our county. The McLennan County Sheriff's Office, we have close to 500 employees. We now, give or take, we'll have 1,400 to 1,500 prisoners in our two jails. We're serving 4,000 to 4,500 meals a day. And we have a lot of guys out on patrol. And when I say guys, I mean men and women. We have some great female deputies. And we try to have 10 officers on each shift. A few years ago when I was with U.S. Marshals. We worked very closely with the McLennan County Sheriff's Office, and they may only have 2 officers on patrol.
Oh, wow.
So we beefed that up quite a bit, and we've done a lot of things since we came in, and very seldom do I say I because I'm a spoke in the wheel. I like to say we because it's a team effort. I have a great team in there. But we have initiated a lot of things that weren't being done. We didn't have a narcotics unit to investigate drugs, and everybody knows that drugs and dope is the head of the snake. You know, almost every crime is somehow related. They're either on dope or they're trying to get money for it. And so we formed a narcotics unit. We also formed a cold case unit in 2017 to investigate brutal murders that happened years ago. We have solved, I believe, 9, and some of them going back as far as 1982, murder of a beautiful girl in Axtell walking home from a party. She was picked up by this thug, and he abused her and beat her and shot her in the head and the chest and threw her in a ditch. And it was unsolved for over 40 years. So we have a lot of other homicides that we've been able to solve, and we formed a human trafficking unit to go after these pimps and scumbags that are trafficking these unsuspecting women, underage kids. We've gone after the predators that are looking, you know, to get hooked up and have sex with underage kids as young as 10, 12 years old. Even one guy wanted a 4-year-old and a toddler. So when he showed up, he was arrested. We filed on him federally because of the age, and he'll be an old man by the time he gets out of federal prison.
Yeah, I think that's you guys have received a
Take a break.
Oh,
He wanted to just take a second.
hold a second. Yep.
Excuse me.
Oh yeah, no problem.
This allergy's killing me.
Man. And we're making you talk a lot.
Well, that's the hazard of being a guest on this show. We're going to make you talk a lot.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay.
Yeah, you can call timeout anytime.
So I got a follow-up question related to that.
You go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Sheriff, particularly those task forces and areas of investigation that you talked about, it does seem, you know, this idea of Crossroads about where Waco is in the state. I mean, some of these are moving through human trafficking and narcotics and other things are moving through the county and other places. How is Waco positioned to kind of operate in law enforcement in those sorts of areas? Yeah.
Waco is in a perfect position for that. You know, it's 100 miles south of Dallas, 100 miles north of Austin, right on the I-35 corridor, which is the main thoroughfare coming up from the border on up to the northern states. And so we're getting human trafficking coming down, you know, from Dallas, Fort Worth, different places. We've got them coming up from Austin. We've had some of these traffickers bringing girls in from Arkansas. We have tied some of the criminals back to a big organization out of New York. We've had our guys running search warrants with the New York police. We've had them in Las Vegas. We ran search warrants on houses in Las Vegas that were trafficking the young girls right here in Waco, and also Austin. I mean, it's like a huge networked spider web all across the country. And so it's not just local, but they are coming in here trafficking some of our local people. So we hit them all as hard as we possibly can.
Yeah,
It's kind of the ugly side of being a crossroads town, really. And
yeah, it is.
And that plays into maybe some of the historical record too, if we want to jump into that a little bit. I did find So McLennan County chartered 1849. Our first sheriff was a gentleman named Robert Holm, and if you remember when we've looked at we've read the handbook or the history where Erath was talking about it was just him and Shapley Ross and a few other guys standing around going, okay, we need somebody needs to be the county judge. So they were all kind of volunteering for whatever positions they needed to have. Who knows? I don't know whether Holm just volunteered or if he was really had that in his heart, but he was our first acting sheriff. And then I love the fact that probably one of our most famous or accomplished sheriffs was Sol Ross. And you want to tell us a little bit about Sol?
Absolutely. What an incredible guy. Sol Ross was a young ranger in 1860 when they had the famous Peace River fight with the Comanches. And the Rangers were able to defeat the Comanches, and they recovered a couple of people that they realized were Caucasian. And one of them happened to be Cynthia Ann Parker. And they did not know exactly who she was at the time, but they recognized her because she had blue eyes. And she almost got shot because it was a running gun battle between the Rangers and the Comanches. And so Sol Ross was very active in bringing Cynthia Ann Parker back to her family. And anyway, it's always been a question whether she wanted to come back or not. She was captured when she was like 7 years old, and then when she was recovered, she'd been with the Indians, I believe, 23 years.
Yeah.
And so she was totally Indianized, as they called it at the time, and assimilated into the tribe. She was married to a warrior named Pita Nakona, and some say he was killed in the fight, some say he wasn't, but her son became a very famous Comanche leader and chief named Quanah Parker. And then at the end of the Indian Wars in the late 1870s, Quanah Parker was very instrumental in getting a lot of the captives back that the Indians had captured over the years. And so he became a friend of a lot of people, a lot of the ranchers. In fact, Samuel Burke Burnett, that has a big 4-6s ranch, was befriended Quanah Parker. And inside the big house on the ranch, Quanah Parker was their guest several times, as well as President Teddy Roosevelt and all that. And so Parker became friends with the president and has been photographed in some of the parades with Teddy Roosevelt. A very interesting story to be a Comanche war chief, and then later on, and he was very instrumental in trying to calm down the friction between the Indians and the settlers and and the army, the cavalry, to try to make peace.
Yeah. He had an impressive life too. Almost the counterpoint to Sol Ross, actually, from the Indian perspective. Just like you said, went from a warrior to being a statesman for the Indian nations that were in Oklahoma. So
I'll continue about Ross for just a minute.
Keep going about Sol Ross. Yeah.
Such an interesting character, unbelievable guy. He became a brigadier general in the Confederate Army during the Civil War, and then he was sheriff of McLennan County in the early 1870s. And he was the one responsible for forming the Texas County Sheriff's Association. And that was in 1874. They had their first meeting in Corsicana, and he called that. And I think close to 100 Texas sheriffs at the time showed up. And that is a huge association now. They have conferences every year in Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and several thousand members. So anyway, Sol Ross was, excuse me, he was later elected governor of Texas, and Sul Ross University, I believe in Alpine, is also named after him. He's also buried in Oakwood Cemetery right here in Waco. But what an unbelievable guy, what an unbelievable career, and he is the only Texas sheriff that has ever been elected governor of Texas.
So far,
The only county sheriff.
So far, Sheriff, I don't know if you're looking for a third career.
Let me make it clear. I'm certainly not. Thank you.
Yeah, fascinating character.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier the Chisholm Trail, and you can imagine early on Texas frontier. A lot of the people that would go to work or even come out to live on the frontier or work in the cattle drive business weren't the most savory characters, right? I mean, they might have been running from something. They're living on the edges of society for a reason.
Well, that's very true. And in the late 60s and certainly early 70s, there was a real demand for leather and also beef in the northern United States. And at that time, the railheads did not come down past Wichita, Kansas, and Abilene, Kansas. So to get the cattle that were needed up north, they had to be driven at least as far as Kansas. And so at the time, after the Civil War, there were millions of free-roaming Texas Longhorns, which were a cross between Mexican cattle and other breeds. But they were very hardy and tough, and they still are. Texas Longhorns are still an incredible breed of cattle, and certainly an iconic breed. But these cattle were rounded up by cattle outfits, cowboys that were formed for the purpose of the cattle drives. And so they would round up 2 to 3, sometimes 4,000 of these cattle in South Texas and start moving them north. And so at some point they had to cross the Brazos River to get on the east side to go on north to the railheads in Kansas. And they'd have to go through the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And it was a very dangerous time. So when the suspension bridge was completed in 1870, it gave a way for the cattle to be moved across the Brazos right here in Waco. And you probably heard Billy Walker's song "Cross the Brazos" at Waco, and
it's actually our song for the podcast. So they
Theme
heard
song.
it. They heard it right now
I did
before
not
we
know
started
that.
talking. Yeah,
I didn't know that. I love that song.
Yeah, I do too.
It's as good as you get.
Yeah.
So, anyway, that's where all the herds would kind of culminate here in Waco and cross the river on the suspension bridge, because a lot of the river crossings, unless they had a real rocky bottom, the cattle, could bog down or they would drown, and the outfits were losing a lot of cattle in the rivers, especially if they were on a rise. So this was a unbelievable thing to happen, to have this suspension bridge right here in Waco. And at the time, it was the longest single spanning bridge west of the Mississippi when it was built. And so anyway, I think the man that built it was the one that built the Brooklyn Bridge in New York. And so anyway,
designed it Roebling, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
a lot of the material that was supplied for the bridge came from the Roebling Company.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's correct. And anyway, then they would move the herds on north, and Fort Worth was the final point to get all your supplies before you cross the Red River into Indian Territory and then on to Kansas. And so the Crescent Prairie outside of Fort Worth at any given time, they said, would have 8 to 10 to 15,000 Longhorns milling around while the outfits went into Fort Worth to get their supplies of gunpowder or ammunition or beans and bread and hardtack, all of that. And anyway, then on to Kansas. And usually took 3 to 4 months from South Texas to get to Kansas.
Well, in the historical record, the one infamous outlaw that came across was John Wesely Hardin. So it's a name a lot of people have heard from the Old West. So he was one of those guys who did the Chisholm Trail several times, and he has a tangent connection. A lot of his crimes were not committed in Waco, but in 1871, he was arrested in Marshall, Texas, for the murder of a Waco city marshal. A guy named Laban John Hoffman was the city marshal. And, I don't know if that happened while he was on a cattle drive or not, but interestingly enough, they arrested him. They were trying to transport him back to Waco. A couple of Texas state policemen were escorting him, and he had a gun hidden away and managed to kill one and ride off. And he was only 17 years old at the time, and went on to have, a lot more outlaw experiences beyond that. But that was John Wesely Hardin's Waco connection.
A very, very dangerous individual, and was only in his teens, kind of like Billy the Kid, just very ruthless.
Yeah, didn't really have a regard for anyone. Claims he killed over 42 people in his lifetime.
We're not sure about the number, but it very well could be.
Yeah.
We know he killed a lot of people, and if you looked at him wrong, he'd gun you down.
So Sam Bass is also a name that's pretty infamous in Texas.
Yeah, there's another outlaw. So not too much further, in 1878, he got his start. Actually, I found he'd been to Waco in 1875. We talked about on the other podcast about entertainment or competitions in Waco, right? Our sports episode. And horse racing was kind of one of the first big, I don't know, it's not a competition. It's not really an athletic event, so to speak, but horse racing.
And the track was out where Oakwood is now, is where the racing track was for horses.
So somewhere along the way, a young Sam Bass got his hands on a pretty good racehorse and was going through Texas and winning quite a bit. But like all good horses, they all good athletes, they got a shelf life, and his horse wasn't winning much at some point. He ends up forming a gang, and they go rob a gold train coming through Big Springs, Nebraska in 1877, and at the time netted $60,000 in gold coins.
That's a lot of money in 1877.
That is a lot back then. That would be a fortune today.
Yeah. So that probably encourages you to keep doing it, right? If you hit it big the first time, it's kind of like going to Vegas.
Absolutely, he was doing something right.
Hey, that's not the that's not the message we're trying to project.
Crime doesn't pay. Well, it kind of did for a little bit, but all good things come to an end, don't they? And so he got chased around. Right? They tried to started trying to rub some stagecoaches and some other stuff. Ended up back in North Texas, and so here's where he crossed through Waco again. He and what was left of his gang were making their way south, and they came through Waco, sure, because they crossed the bridge, everything. But they were gonna knock over a bank while they were here. That was their intent. Now he didn't know one of his gang had already made a deal with the Texas Rangers, and he was supposed to.
He was an informant, right?
He was an informant. He was going to let them know. Where they were going to be, so they could catch up to him and get Bass. So he's trying to he dissuades Bass from actually hitting the bank here in Waco, but before he leaves, while he's in town, spends his last gold coin from that robbery, that original at the saloon, at one of the saloons here in town.
It would be nice to know what saloon that was.
Yeah, wouldn't it?
Here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so July 19th, a few days later, they made their way down to Round Rock, and along the way, his informant in the gang got word to the Rangers, and that's where they had the gunfight that took out Sam Bass in Round Rock, Texas.
He also had a cave that he was hiding out in the Salado area, and the cave is still there, and you can go visit the cave. It's almost right downtown in Salado.
Oh, wow.
So very interesting. I've been in the cave when I was a kid.
Did you find any gold coins in there? Did you?
No, I didn't find it.
He didn't have any left by
Ding
then.
around?
He,
Well,
he bounced his last check. That's my goal. Is the last check needs to bounce. Yeah.
Well, yeah, you did time it right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I'm sure there were a lot more criminal goings on.
Sure.
In between 78 and our next encounter we'll talk about. But we're trying to talk about the big ones here, the nationally known, or things that were of a greater exposure beyond just Waco. So the next one, Judge Gerald, and this was related to. You explain how these are all related, real quick.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this in the entertainment episode, right? Yesterday, did we talk about
Little
Judge
bit.
Gerald?
Yeah.
Judge Gerald. Yeah, and so I don't know what you're going for. How do you want me to connect?
Well, he was connected to Brann, so right, he was one of Brann's supporters.
Yeah.
So explain who Brann was.
Yeah, so William Cowper Brann, who is the editor and author of the Iconoclast here in town, which was a nationally distributed newspaper, and Brann was famous nationally, sometimes controversial locally, because he sometimes liked to attack. Maybe things that people didn't want attacked. We've actually got an episode on the podcast on Brann himself, because he would attack maybe some sacred cows and things like that. And sometimes he would expose things that were covered up that needed to be talked about and looked at. And he was a very controversial figure. In fact, when we did our Oakwood Cemetery episode, Brann is the only headstone in Oakwood that someone's taken a shot at. So he still proves to be
He'd be the equivalent today of an internet troll.
Yeah, that's what Randy Lane called him, as Waco's first troll.
Yeah. And if you look at the definition of iconoclast, it spells it out. Says a person who attacks cherished beliefs or institutions.
Yep.
And of course, in this case, he was talking about Baylor and the Baptist and a lot of other people. And so his newspaper basically stated what its purpose was.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some of that needed to be, some of that is a good thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We all need accountability, but
depending on who you ask.
It's on how you do it. So to set the stage, Brann had ignited some fervor by won't get into the whole details of what that was about, but he'd been recently kidnapped by some male Baylor students who were wanting to defend the honor of their college and the females at their college, and they had threatened to tar and feather him. That didn't work out. They roughed him up a little bit. They ended up letting him go without doing too much damage, but I'm sure that scared him quite a bit. And Judge Gerald, who was one of his supporters here in town, he actually had a great. We mentioned Ross a minute ago, but Gerald had been in the Civil War. He was a colonel, had been wounded 4 times. He actually had a lame arm coming out of that. He had come to Waco in 1873. He had a legal background, but he also did some newspaper. He owned some newspapers, did some editing there. But he was elected county judge in 1876 and held that office for 8 years. Also served in the legislature, served as a state senator. Was appointed postmaster for Waco. So he was an accomplished guy. And
but felt strongly about his support of Brann.
Yeah. What I read about him, I mean, he was kind of the same cloth. He was kind of a aggressive and gruff kind of guy, and kind of tell it like it is. And so after Brann had been kidnapped, Gerald wanted to get something in one of the local papers, kind of a supportive editorial. And the owners of those papers were the Harris brothers. And somewhere in there, the Harris brothers wouldn't print what he'd sent, and he wanted to get it back, and that led to a conflict.
Yeah, a shootout between Gerald and the Harris brothers, and Gerald loses his lame arm, so he gets shot, I guess, in his lame arm and has to lose that, and the Harris brothers don't survive the encounter.
Exactly. Let me back up just a hair.
Yeah. Fill in some gaps.
Before the shootout, I believe it was Tom Harris and Judge Gerald had a fist fight on the street, and Gerald got whipped, and so he was pretty mad about it. So he started handing out circulars.
He only had one hand. He only had one arm, to be fair, right?
Okay.
Fighting a one-armed guy.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, he was handing out these flyers calling Harris a liar, a coward, and a cur, and challenged him to a duel in the middle of the street. And so that's what led up to the gunfight. He had gotten his you-know-what whipped, and so he was mad about it. So here came both Harris brothers, and they came out second in the gunfight, and that's never a good thing. But both of them were killed, and Judge Gerald was wounded. But it started with a fist fight where they beat up the judge, and I guess, he was an underdog because he only had one arm, and they took advantage of that. So anyway, that's kind of what led up to the gunfight.
But then reelected as judge in the next election.
Absolutely.
How
could you not reelect him?
everybody,
I'd vote for him.
Yeah. So ironically, I mean, we're sitting in the 20th floor of the Alco building, looking out the window. Right next to us is 3rd and Austin, which is the scene of that gun battle. So we're right here. One of the quotes, and I don't, if I remember the play-by-play of the fight. Gerald and the first brother kind of ran into each other, and then they quickly kind of pulled on each other and started shooting. The other brother was across the street, saw what was going on, so he started shooting at the judge, and the judge turned and fired one shot and put him down. And so as the judge was recovering, he asked one of the people that was taking care of him, I don't remember that Harris brother's name, but, where did I hit him? And they said, well, you hit him right in the throat. And, that killed him. And he goes, well, I was aiming for his head. So he was a little disappointed in his shot placement. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I can see the election posters now. Yeah. I was aiming for his head. You mentioned Brann. So the Brann shootout takes place nearby. I mean, just over at 4th and Austin, and there is a historic marker there that you can see, kind of on the side of the city building, or the WISD building there on Franklin, that kind of marks near the location of that shootout. And we talked about this on that podcast, but. In that case, Brann had offended the propriety of some of the young ladies at Baylor University, and a gentleman took Tom Davis. Is that his name? Yeah, yes. Tom Davis took offense at that, and they passed each other on the sidewalk, and Davis took a shot at Brann. Brann turned and fired at Davis, and they both were mortally wounded in the shootout and passed away there.
Yeah. And my grandfather, Emmett Parnell McNamara, happened to be in town. He was like 17 or 18 and happened to witness the shooting, and he would talk to us about it. He said he'd never seen a man get killed before, and really disturbed him. And he later became a deputy sheriff in 1905 and then went with U.S. Marshals. But that was a very early experience for him.
Yeah.
He never forgot. But I'm pretty sure it was the Brann Davis shootout that he saw.
Yeah.
1898, so that fits.
He was born in 1880, so he would have been 17, 18.
Well, and because the iconoclast was a national and a little bit international, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he had a pretty wide readership for his periodical or whatever you would call it at the time. So him getting gunned down in this battle, I mean, that was national news.
Yeah, definitely.
Sure was. But
And we're starting to see why Waco had that moniker 6-shooter junction here with violence in the streets around the turn of the century.
Yeah.
absolutely. And at the time, apparently, dueling in Texas was legal, or at least they didn't think much about it. Two men walk out in the street, they have a gunfight, one of them doesn't come back, and it was okay. On my grandfather's deputation papers in 1905, he had, in his oath of office, he had to swear that he had not been involved in a duel with deadly weapons or acted as a second in a duel, nor had he carried a challenge to a duel, which if he had meant that he'd kill somebody on the street in a duel. And so that was in 1905, and then he was deputized again under a different sheriff in 1916, and that is even on the oath of office in 1916.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
I've got both of them. I got one right here, but I have both of them on the wall in the office. But it's just very unusual to see that.
So I wonder when that fades out. I mean, that surprises me in 1916.
Yeah.
I wonder when that fades out as a practice. And actually, you offended me earlier, Rick. So I don't know if you'll be my second sheriff.
I'm done. All right, whatever you want. Okay, so that gets us into the 20th century. I think the McNamara clan has some interesting, and you got to be careful when you say this. When you say someone has an interesting connection to the reservation,
Yeah, well, yeah.
but I'll let Sheriff explain.
At the time of the reservation, which had gone on for many years, it was a 2 or 3 block square area on 2nd Street. It was the red light district. It's where all the prostitutes plied their trade, so to speak. And it was regulated by the police. And the girls were registered. They had health cards. And it was patrolled very carefully. And so Guy McNamara became police chief in 1915. So in 1917, the government decided to bring a military base in called Camp MacArthur. And the only way that they would bring the military base in and the air base, which was Richfield, was if the city shut down the red light district. So that fell on Guy McNamara, the chief of police, and John Dollins, who was the mayor. And so Guy McNamara put out a decree that all prostitutes had to vacate the city limits of Waco by dark on Saturday. And if you read any of the newspaper articles, that's what it says. You have to be out of town by dark Saturday. Didn't have a time, but just dark, whatever that was at the time. And any prostitute found within the city limits after dark was going to be arrested and prosecuted. And that's the way it was explained in the newspaper article. So they shut the red light district down, and World War I was raging, overseas. And so the U.S. had just gotten involved in the war, and they needed military bases, and so they brought in Camp MacArthur and also Richfield.
Yeah.
And so, but that's what had to happen in order for them to bring the bases in, because they didn't want the soldiers. They knew what would happen,
But so it wasn't really necessarily for higher morality reasons. There were some practical reasons why they didn't want
syphilis was the main reason.
Yeah, that was a big problem back then. Yep.
Yeah. And there was never prostitution in Waco again.
Dream on. We're dealing with it practically every day. It's kind of ironic that, here, I'm in law enforcement here, 105 years, 106 years later, we're still dealing with it, but maybe on a little different level. So anyway, it's
The heart of man.
Yeah, exactly.
The kind of a turbulent time, the early part of the 20th century. There's lots of challenges. I think Waco's starting to see an economic decline. There's greater social unrest, and one of the events that happened was a riot out in Lorena.
Yeah, so there's a revival of the Klan, which kind of arose post-Reconstruction in the South and then kind of died out. It's back in the 1920s. And as part of that locally, there was a large parade staged in Lorena. About 4,000 people turn out to watch the Klan march through Lorena there, and where they're confronted by the local sheriff.
Yes, in 1921.
Mm-hmm. And so I think the sheriff, Bob Buchanan, asked the leaders to identify themselves. They refuse. They continue to march. Buchanan tries to unmask one of the leaders of the Klan, and that's when gunfire broke out. And Buchanan had 2 deputies with him, Sheriff, and you were talking about Red Burton, who was one of the deputies that was with Sheriff Bob Buchanan at the time.
absolutely. Red Burton was a very really wonderful lawman. He was later on a Texas Ranger, and then he was chief police of Waco. And I had the honor of meeting him in the late 60s. I believe it was 1968, and I have a picture of my brother Mike and me with Red Burton. And of course, he was a elderly gentleman at the time, but my dad was a good friend of Red Burton's, and he would always talk about what a tough, good lawman Red Burton was, and also what a good lawman Bob Buchanan was. Those guys were fearless, and they were facing a crowd of several thousand. And at one point after the fracas, after the shooting and all, it's pretty well documented that Buchanan and Red Burton and maybe another officer or two had to take refuge in a drugstore there in Lorena because the crowd was going to try to kill them all. And it was a very tense, very dangerous situation for the lawmen. And, you think about a crowd marching and attacking the lawmen, disarming them, shooting one of them, people getting stabbed. Bob Buchanan was well within his rights to use his knife and protect himself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the play-by-play went something like he, like you said, he tries to stop them. They continue to march. He goes up to one of the leaders at the front of the parade, tries to pull off his mask. One of the other Klansmen that has a flag, carrying a flag, hits him over the head, knocks him to the ground, and then apparently he's got 2 pistols. One of the Klansmen grabs one of the pistols, starts shooting him. He pulls a knife and kind of starts stabbing his way out. Burton is immediately jumped on by several other Klansmen. He has his gun drawn, sees Buchanan on the ground. He starts shooting, firing back once he hears Buchanan say that he'd been shot. So somehow in that scrum, they were able to get enough control to get out of the situation and maybe into the drugstore, like you said. There were 5 people that got stabbed. A Klansman shot besides Buchanan being shot. He was shot under the arm. And one interesting. So a friend of mine here, Charlie Rigney, that you might know, that's his grandfather, and the family history is that that the family's always looked for that second gun to show up somewhere, so they could find out who it was
that took the gun.
That took the gun and shot him. And to date, they have not recovered that gun.
Yeah, and reflective of the political mood of the times. I mean, politically, they go after Buchanan.
Yeah, they indict him for the murder of one of the people he stabbed. There was a huge outcry. Now, there's some other important Wacoans at the time that were in different places. Pat Neff was actually governor at the time. And, his story, I mean, he had been the county prosecutor. I mean, he was friends with all these guys. He had only recently been elected governor. And so he reached out and was really to the judge and to the county prosecutor here saying, hey, you can have whatever resources you want. He ends up providing the Texas Rangers to be bailiffs for the court proceedings because of, you couldn't have the sheriff's deputies couldn't be the bailiffs. And some, his political opponent was a constable, so the constables couldn't be the bailiffs. So the compromise was to bring in the Rangers. And so it's great. You see Neff in the background trying to support Buchanan. He even gets the attorney general to make a ruling, to give an opinion. We see that today still. The Texas attorney general give an opinion on whether you should be able to allowed to wear a mask in a parade. And he came back and said, no, you according to the Texas Constitution, you shouldn't be able to do that. I was thinking of a modern equivalent for this.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen that recently with something like Antifa, right? These groups that want to hide behind a mask and go out in public and create havoc,
create mayhem,
intimidation, change public opinion.
It's very similar.
Yeah.
Really is.
Yeah. So state support, but also local support. Another McNamara comes in, the John McNamara that you mentioned earlier, sheriff, as a supporter.
Yeah, his bond, he had to get bonded out of jail, and some of the supporters were the mayor, John Dollins, John McNamara, the former county attorney, and the former sheriff, came in support of Buchanan when he had this huge public outcry against him. So,
there was a lot of sympathy toward the Klan at the time, and that was a sad part about it, because you had those supporters in the Klan against law enforcement, and so Buchanan really had his back to the wall, with these charges on him.
Yeah, and just so you'll know, the popular support of the Klan dies out in the late 20s. I mean,
it burns fast and quick, and then they're gone. Yeah.
Very interesting, very brutal time there.
Yeah.
Really.
Yep. Okay, here's a couple that live in infamy even today. And,
a lot of folks don't know they have a Waco connection. Yeah.
Modern legend. So Bonnie and Clyde have a huge Waco connection.
Yeah, so a couple of times. So Clyde Barrow is arrested in town in 1926, and as a juvenile, spends a couple of days in jail. He's arrested again in 1929 and let off the hook then. And then he's arrested. Well, he's transferred in after another arrest into McLennan County Jail on March the 3rd, 1930, pleading guilty to 7 charges that included the theft of William Cameron's car.
I bet that was a nice car. I'm just thinking.
I'm sure it was.
Well, and I remember reading somewhere, one of the things that made the Clyde's gang successful is they would steal nice cars with big engines. They knew the value of the getaway, and so I could see them being drawn. I'm sure Mr. Cameron had a very nice vehicle.
Oh, absolutely. And when Ford came out with the V8, that's what their car of choice was, because it could outrun almost any car on the road. And I believe that either Bonnie or Clyde wrote Ford a thank you letter. They were taunting police, and they were just on such a crazy spree, murder spree. But I've always heard that. I've never seen the letter, but that's supposedly he thanked Ford for the Ford V8, which came out, I believe, in 33, something like that.
And similarly, they would arm themselves in ways beyond what the normal law enforcement had.
Yeah,
they broke into armories at National Guards stations, or in the Midwest, and would get B8 bars, Browning automatic rifles,
Yep.
which shot a big 30-06 round and could go automatic.
Yeah. They used all kind of weapons, but they did like top of the line. They liked the Thompson submachine guns, which shot a 45 ACP, but the big one was the BARs that shot the 30-06, like you said, and that would either go completely through a vehicle or disable it if they shot the engine.
Yeah, and at the time, law enforcement, they were probably carrying 38 revolvers.
38s, yeah. Most of them were carrying the 38s. Every once in a while, you had somebody that carry a 45 automatic, but your standard police gun, even when I went into law enforcement, was a revolver, either a 38 or a 357. But back then, 38 was a main gun, and it was just underpowered. For
it's a pea shooter compared to
absolutely.
those rifles in the.
Speaking of guns, so March 3rd, he's transferred in to McLennan County. Bonnie comes and visits him several times while he's
he's on trial
in the McLennan County Jail.
Yep.
And in one of those visits,
the old jail,
the old jail
behind the courthouse.
Yeah. And then on one of those visits, she passes him a gun.
And rumor has it she had it hidden in her bra.
Okay,
And so
that makes sense.
They embrace. They do an embrace, and she tells him where the gun is, and while they're embracing, he dislodges it, puts it, hides it from, because they're being watched by the jailers. So that's how he sneaks it in.
And they break out. So Clyde breaks out prison, steal a couple of cars, and leave the county.
Yep, has a couple cellmates. The jailer comes to bring a glass of milk to one of them, and the jailers were not armed, and so they got the drop on him, locked him in the jail cell, and then went downstairs, and there was another jailer they had to get past, but they got the drop on him too, and there they go.
Probably Bonnie and Clyde killed more police officers than any other outlaws, and I believe they killed a total of 11 or 12 people, and like 9 of them were police officers. And when they left here, it's my understanding that they killed a detective or 2 in Hillsborough, and just when they would see police, they'd just open fire on them. And so they had them all outgunned most of the time.
Yeah.
And so...
Well, and from his break here, he did get caught again a few days later up in Ohio, and the McLennan County Sheriff went up and retrieved him personally and brought him back, and then that was when Clyde got sent to Eastham Prison. Is that down there, Houston, I believe?
Sheriff, where's Easton Prison for him? Yeah.
Eastham is down in that area.
Eastham,
At the time, most of your units were down there close to Huntsville in that area.
Yeah.
Now they're all over the state, but back then it's down in there. Yeah.
Okay. And apparently it was his experiences there that really took a bad kid and took him to a whole different level of bad. So, and then, it was after that, for those who've seen movies or documentaries, that, he eventually gets paroled from there, hooks up with Bonnie. They go on their bigger crime spree and eventually get gunned down
in Louisiana,
by Frank Hammer.
Yeah. Well, they did kill a prison guard, and he teamed up with a really bad, dangerous guy named Raymond Hamilton in TDC. So he was running with Hamilton for a good while there. And there's a gun collector here in Waco that has the 38 that Bonnie had on her person when they were killed. It was in the car, and it's believed to be the same gun that she has on in the picture. And I've seen the gun, matched it up, and it's all documented. And a museum had it, and then said they didn't want anything to do with Bonnie and Clyde, because they thought it would show them in a good light. So they put it up for auction. And so this guy here, he's a friend of mine. He has the Bonnie and Clyde pistol.
Oh, wow.
That's Bonnie's pistol.
Wow.
And it's got the fake stag grips on it that she put on it. She wanted to spiff it up a little bit. So anyway, it's just an interesting thing. Bonnie Parker's pistol is right here in Waco, or one of her pistols. She had a bunch of them.
Yeah. And I saw references that she actually had family in Waco. Like when she was visiting Clyde in jail, she was staying with some extended family that lived in Waco. I couldn't find any more information about them, but okay. So let's fast forward. So actually several years to a story that our listeners may be more familiar with. Kenneth McDuff.
Yes. Kenneth McDuff was probably, without a doubt, the most brutal, sadistic killer that I ever dealt with in my entire career. And I knew about him because my father, T.P. McNamara, was the deputy U.S. Marshal here at the time. McDuff killed 3 teenagers in Everman, and he was living in Rosebud. And so he and a guy named Roy Dale Green were riding around up in the Fort Worth area in a town called Everman. They went to a ball diamond late in the evening, and there was 3 kids standing out by a car, 2 teenage boys that were 16 and their 16-year-old cousin, Marie Sullivan. And so McDuff takes a pistol and kidnaps all 3 of them, puts them in the trunk of their car, and he drove them out into the country, he and Roy Dale Green, and he opens the trunk, got Marie Sullivan out, and then he shot both of the boys in the head and kills both of them in the trunk of the car. And he backs the car up into a fence on a gravel road. Then he takes Marie Sullivan to another location where he horribly brutalizes this little girl. He even used a broken broomstick on her. And then afterwards, Roy Dale Green holds her feet, and McDuff sits on her chest and breaks her throat with a broomstick. So he eventually was known as the Broomstick Killer. But he comes back to Rosebud, and then 2 days later, Roy Dale is riding around with another couple, and it comes on the radio that these kids have been found in Everman, brutally murdered. And he falls apart and tells the other couple in the car that McDuff did it. And he said, I was with him. So they immediately drove to the sheriff's office, and Roy Dale Green made a statement that he was there when McDuff had killed these kids.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, when Sheriff Brady Pamplin was told about the murders, he got with the sheriff in Robertson County, where McDuff was believed to have been. He had a date with a girl, and so Larry Pamplin, who was Brady's son, Larry and I were in the same grade. So I'm in Baylor at the time. Larry's in, I believe, college down in Huntsville. He just happened to be home at the time. So they all get armed, and the 2 sheriffs and Larry wait for McDuff to come home and bring this girl back, hoping and praying that she's still alive. So McDuff does. He drives up in her driveway, and so Sheriff Sonny Elliott.
How old was he at the time? Was he a young man? I mean, I guess he had to have been. Probably in his 20s?
At the time, he was 20.
Yeah, wow.
1966. He and I are, McDuff and I are 2 weeks apart in age. So he was 20 years old at the time, and already a brutal, sadistic killer. And so when he drove up in the driveway, the sheriff stood up and were going to shoot him. And he had this girl, his date, sitting next to him, like that's the way everybody did back in the
Those
60s.
Old bench seat cars.
Yeah, exactly.
Can't do that now.
No. And so anyway, they couldn't open fire on him, and he threw it in reverse, and the chase was on. They chased him down the street of Bremond. And so That car broke down. He jumps out of that, commandeers a pickup. And so they chase him in that, recover the girl safely, and they shoot the tires and the engine out of the pickup. And so they capture him. And he is tried in Everman, and he got the death sentence. And so he was on death row for a lot of years. And then when the Supreme Court decided the death penalty was cruel and unusual the way it was applied, he was commuted to life. And then later on, he was paroled out. And so we couldn't believe in 1989 when we found out that he had paroled out. I called Sheriff Larry Pamplin. He had become sheriff after his dad retired. His dad was sheriff there almost 30 years. So then Larry ran for sheriff and got it. And so I said, "You're just not going to believe this." I said, "They paroled Kenneth McDuff." And he said, "No, there's no way." And I said, "Well, they have." So we found out where he was. And this is the sick part of the story. He was going to class at TSTC on a state grant. We were paying for this low-life serial killer's education. And so my brother and I went out and talked to the police chief there on TSTC campus. It was TSTI at the time, and told them, "Have you ever heard of Kenneth McDuff?" And they go, "No, we've never heard of him." Well, it had happened 20 years before.
Yeah.
Those police officers were, some of them may not have even been born yet. They were real young. And I said, "You've got a serial killer sitting in class out here by somebody's daughter, somebody's son." I said, "He'll kill boys, he'll kill girls." I said, "He's a horrible, dangerous, dangerous criminal." So they were kind of watching him. Then he threatens to kill this kid in Rosebud while he's out on parole. They put him back in prison. They should have put him in for life. And he paroles. They release him 3 months later after he threatens to kill this other kid, knowing he's a triple murderer. So he's right back in Waco. And so anybody that was in the Waco, Texas area from 1989 until we caught him or got him caught in 1992 passed McDuff on the street. And it is very scary, because if you're a young lady, you're lucky. By the grace of God, you're still alive, because he was killing women. He was up and down Waco Drive, Valley Mills Drive. He was all over this place. He was going from Waco to Austin to Dallas. He even ran a police roadblock with a girl tied up in his truck and got away. And we found her 7 years later buried on a creek bank on 933 out toward Golson. He just absolutely was pulling these girls off the street wherever he could find them. Poor little Melissa Northrop working at the Quick Pack on I-35. He went in there. She was working the midnight shift and kidnapped her, took her to Dallas, brutalized her and killed her, threw her in a gravel pit. She was recovered 2 or 3 months later. Anyway, he was just on a rampage, and we were frantic. We formed a task force to try to catch him of U.S. Marshals. We had police officers of all kinds, deputy sheriffs, Waco police, and we had our helicopters up every day, and we had the Rangers involved. We had the federal agents at ATF. I mean, it was an incredible effort. We were trying to catch this guy before he killed more people. And so we realized after about 3 or 4 weeks of really, really big, intense manhunts all over, not just the county, but the state, that he was not here, because we were arresting his cohorts. One guy got 5 years federal time for having 122 bullet that was his friend. So we were hitting these people really hard, and we knew that if they knew where he was, they would turn him in. And they told us that, said, "We can't fade the heat for this guy." So anyway, we reached out to Unsolved Mysteries, that program with Jack Palance, and then we reached out to Unsolved Mysteries with John Walsh.
America's Most
Wanted.
Yeah.
And sent all the information on McDuff to America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries. So they aired Unsolved Mysteries on Wednesday, America's Most Wanted on Friday. We got a call Monday from Kansas City, U.S. Marshals and police, said, we think he may be up here. And we think he may be a guy named Richard Fowler that's driving on a trash truck. And some of his co-workers saw the series on him and said, man, it's got to be him. And so anyway, we sent fingerprints immediately to Kansas City. And they called back in about an hour and said, it is him. He is up here. And we couldn't believe it. We had probably 50 or 60 lawmen in the U.S. Marshal's office here on all these different teams trying to find him. So I can't tell you the feeling when we got that call. We called everybody in. I mean, there were people screaming, lawmen, some of them are crying, going, my gosh, we got to get him. And so they set up on him. He had a trash route and very appropriately working on a trash truck. And not to disparage them, but he was a bigger piece of trash than anything they were hauling. And so anyway, they set up on it and he was arrested. And then they called us and said, we got him. So they sent a U.S. Marshal's jet from down to pick us up. And so I took 8 or 9 other officers with me, U.S. attorneys, ATF guys, took a ranger, took Austin Homicide, took narcotics guy from Temple, just right there on the street. I said, go with me to Kansas City tonight, go with me. And nobody turned me down. And so we flew in there and interrogated him that night. And of course, he wouldn't up anything about anybody. He was laughing about stabbing people in prison, and hey, he held his knife, and the other guy, hey, he held his knife, and he had the reach on him, and he was just a brutal, cold-blooded guy. And we started quizzing him about where he was on Christmas Day, which is the day that he kidnapped Colleen Reed, the beautiful little girl washing her car down there in Austin. And he said, I don't know where I was Christmas. And I said, sure, everybody knows where you were Christmas Day. And he said, not me. And I said, yeah, you do. Let me refresh your memory. And so I kind of refreshed his memory that he was driving around Austin, and we'd already gotten information from the guy that was with him that he was trying to kidnap girls down there. And at that time, he backed in a corner, and we shut the interview down, and we flew him back the next day. And there was a crowd at the airport waiting to try to kill him. I mean, they were screaming and yelling at him.
Yeah.
And on the way back, I looked at I shouldn't say this, but I looked at the emergency exit on the plane, and I said, I would sure love to open that and throw him out at 30,000 feet.
Yeah.
Let him think about it. It'd take him about 6 minutes to hit the ground. Anyway, so we got him back to the federal courthouse, and there was another huge crowd there screaming and cursing him. And so there's a very famous picture. I say famous, it went nationwide, and it's a U.S. Marshal holding the crowd back with a machine gun, and my brother and I walking behind him, having to protect Kenneth McDuff, taking him into the courthouse. And it's a very compelling picture. And so anyway, that's he got the death sentence, got 2 of them. He was convicted of killing 2 different girls, and I witnessed his execution in November of 1998, 7 years after he'd killed these people. And he never apologized, never anything, cold, evil till the very end, cursed God. When the chaplain would try to get him to save his soul. Said, "You're fixing to be executed. You need to save your soul, get right with God." And he just cursed God. So he is the kind of man that it is a pleasure to execute.
Yeah.
And so anyway, he didn't even have anybody to claim his body. He's buried in the prison yard down there. He's just a number now.
Is it likely that there were cases that you couldn't connect to?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We believe that he killed 15 to 20 people, and we've got close to 15 names, people that just vanished that knew him. And there was 3 people that were in Kansas City when he was up there, 3 women that vanished. A couple of them have never been found. One lady was brutally murdered. She'd called her son, said, "There's a big, tall, cowboy-looking guy in here. I'm scared." Her son went up there, got there within 5 minutes. Her purse is there, full of money. She's gone. They found her floating in the river a few days later. And we ran search warrants on his apartment up there, and it was like a slaughterhouse. He had knives, ski masks, duct tape, ropes, everything you need to kidnap people. So anyway,
Wow.
hopefully, as we speak, he's burning in hell. Well, let's take a bit of a break. Thank you, Sheriff McNamara, for being with us. We're going to call this part 1 of Criminal Crossings for the Waco History Podcast. We will be back with Sheriff McNamara for part 2, and so please tune into that also.
Cross the Brazos and Waco, ride hard and I'll make it by dawn.
Thanks for listening to the Waco History Podcast. Like what you heard? Subscribe, rate, and review our show on iTunes so we can reach more listeners. You can find show notes and info on every episode at wacohistorypodcast.com, and more info on Waco's past at wacohistory.org. Our theme music, used with permission, is Cross the Brazos at Waco, performed by the late Billy Walker. For more info on Billy's music, go to billywalker.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
San Antonio.
This has been a Rogue Media Network production.